All right, so we have come to the halfway point in our journey through Awake. We talked last week about how God began the process of healing humanity of the disease of the self-life, and that's that lie of a false identity, essentially. And he did that by first showing us the problem, which is how healing often needs to start, by us seeing the issue at hand and recognizing it. So what God did in order to do that to the whole human race, remember, this is God dealing with all of us. He gave mankind through a representative nation that he created and called out, the nation of Israel, that has been preserved for thousands of years, more than any other nation in the history of civilization. He preserved and called forth the nation of Israel as a representative to teach humankind about the problem that we have through something known as the law. So the law became this X-ray evidence of the cancerous virus within us, within all of us. And that is the life of the flesh, which we have seen over and over again, leads to nothing but death and destruction. So the law put a spotlight on it. It gave us that X-ray vision into seeing the fruitlessness of living according to the flesh, living according to our own strength, our own efforts. That was the whole purpose of the law, ultimately. God was showing us through our failure over and over and over again to keep the law that we needed another way. We needed another way to find righteousness, to find godliness, to find Eden again. The original life that was lost in Eden. Today, we're going to find out how the way and the truth and the life came to this planet 2,000 years ago as Jesus Christ, who came as the answer to the problem, the source of our freedom and the healing of that disease. Jesus is the climax of the story that we're telling. I want you to look at the words of the Apostle Paul with me real quick. This is from the book of Galatians, chapter 4, the first 5 verses. Paul's teaching about this concept, and he says, "Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything, but he's under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." Okay, there's a lot here, but I want to make this very simple for everyone. We, humankind, became like spiritual infants. That word children that he's using there in the Greek is a word for little kids, like little children. We became spiritual children living under that original lie and distrust. Every time that we now operate in fear and hate and unbelief and all of those things we've been talking about, we are like infants who are not standing up and walking in the truth of our true identity and in the fullness of the love of our Creator. So it's this picture that Paul and others give us of God raising up this little child over the course of thousands of years, bringing humanity into maturity. That's the imagery that's getting painted to us. And God began to teach the little child through the law. And that's what those guardians and managers are talking about right there. There's so much that we can get into about that, about how the law was really a safeguard before we really destroyed one another. But we won't get into too much of that right now. God essentially showed us through the law that our self-efforts to clean ourselves up and live on our own do not and would not work. But then it says that there was something else up God's sleeve, right? To wake us up to the problem. It says at the fullness of the time, he sent his Son in order to redeem us. Now, That word redeem is an important word found throughout the whole Bible, and it essentially means to buy something back or to restore something to its original value. So, God sent his Son into the world to restore the world back to the original goodness and life and righteousness and joy that he designed us to walk in. Jesus, the Son, came to bring us back into the family of the Trinity so that we might enjoy again the pure love, the pure acceptance, the wonder, the intimacy of knowing God and knowing one another in the light of truth and grace. That is why Jesus came. And the scriptures say that he did this at the fullness of time. He came at the fullness of time. In other words, he came at just the right point in history when man was ready to be reintroduced to the full truth that had been lost. It's interesting. The gospel that was released out of Israel to all the nations of the world, including West Milford, New Jersey, 2,000 years later. The gospel started on the heels of the Roman Empire, particularly when they had built a road system that, for the first time ever, connected the entire globe in a way that it never been connected before. It was like an internet of dirt, if you want to think of it that way. It connected groups and people like never before. And it was right around that time that the Messiah, Jesus, appeared on the earth. It was the absolute perfect time for a movement and a message to begin traveling across the whole world on the heels of the law and what God had already taught to the Jewish people, to begin to make its way to the four corners of earth. See, God was allowing humankind to grow in our free will. He was allowing us to develop as a civilization. But the moment our free will brought us into more of a connected society, he just poured out the true solution in Jesus Christ. Now, as we get into this, I want to make something very, very clear. Jesus did not come to the earth to start a new religion. He did not come to garner more votes than Muhammad and Buddha so that he would get the most people in his club. Jesus came in order to redeem the image and the glory of God within humankind, and to bring all of us together into fellowship again, into friendship with the Trinity, and to unite the world in love and community through his body. He didn't come to establish a religion of right and wrong. In fact, he came to utterly destroy our systems of right and wrong because they lead to nothing. And the Jews had the perfect system, and it led to failure over and over and over again. Religion, I've heard it said this way before, religion was like the placenta that carried humankind into birth, into real life, which is what the gospel is all about. It brings us into the experience of real, spontaneous, free spirit life, the life of our design. So, let's be clear about something else. Jesus was not just a really, really enlightened teacher. He was not just a prophet, and he was not just a king. Now, he will function in those roles, but that is not the essence of who he is. Jesus Christ is actually God made flesh, perfectly. He is God united with humanity. So this is what's commonly known as the Incarnation, right? And the Incarnation simply means to be made flesh, right? Carne means flesh or meat. It's where you get the word carnivore from. Incarnate means to come into or be made flesh. So we talked last week about how our flesh, lo and behold, is actually good. This comes as a surprise to many people, including many Christians who misunderstand the Bible when it talks about the life of the flesh. The flesh of our being is actually good. It's that self-life, that independent life, that lie, that's the problem. So everyone say right now, my flesh is good. Oh man, I feel like for some people that's tough. Like, feels kind of weird saying it. It's like you're speaking another language. We vilified the flesh so much, but our flesh is designed for glory. Yeah. See, the religions of the world would make us look at ourselves as intrinsically evil. And so numerous people throughout the world and religious systems are vehemently against the Incarnation. And a lot of people think they're against the Incarnation because, you know, it puts Jesus up on a pedestal above their gods or other gods. I want you to know there's a deeper reason why religions and cults are against the Incarnation. The reason is because there's an offense in their heart when they hear this message. How could, and I've heard religious leaders say this from other places, how could a holy God clothe himself with wicked humanity? How? Well, if the juice from the tree of knowledge is running down your beard, that's going to be an easy question for you because you're going to think that way and you're going to see yourself and everyone else as fundamentally evil. But that is the original lie. That is the false identity. Remember, the original lie was seeing ourselves less than complete. Our origin and our true identity is the image of God. It's the original blessing. It's his glory and goodness, not sin. Sin is just the fruit of walking out that lie and distrusting God and living independently. That is the self-life, which is wrong. That's a principle of life, a way of living that became like a disease within our bodies. But our bodies, our souls, are actually good, very good, according to Genesis 1. See, Jesus came to crush the lie of this false identity through his incarnation. And this is part of why the incarnation is so important. It's so vital you understand that perfect God became perfect man because Jesus came to restore us to our identity as glory containers, as offspring of the divine. That is fundamentally who mankind is, who you are. So let's talk about two things that get revealed to mankind through the incarnation of Christ. Who God is and who we are. We'll start with the revelation of who God is. I want to look at the book of Hebrews, the first chapter, which is talking about Jesus right here. It says, the Son is the radiance and only expression of the glory of our awesome God, reflecting God's Shekinah glory, the light being, the brilliant light of the divine, and the exact representation and perfect imprint of his Father's essence. Wow. That's the amplified right there. It leaves no room for debate. Christ fully reveals God. Now, here's why that is so incredibly important for us today, and obviously for anyone else who's ever lived. In our fall, mankind forgot the true face of God. We had, in fact, walked away from the Father of creation, the loving, the accepting, the joyful Trinity, but we still had a desire to worship. That was still there. So we created new gods in our fallen image. And we came to see the real God in a perverted or a dark way. God in our minds became this angry, impatient, unforgiving, distant God who needed to be appeased by good behavior and by sacrifice. Think for a moment, okay? Think about all the quote-unquote gods of mankind. Here's one of the more famous ones. That's Zeus, right there. Okay? The divine king of the heavens from Greek mythology. What I'm about to share with you is completely relevant for today. The people who worshiped that guy are the people that define our democracy today and much of the philosophies that we live by and the society that we walk in. The culture behind that figure up there has had tremendous influence on us today. We still walk in their influence. Do not think that is any less true in their philosophy than it is in their religion. This image of Zeus has flooded our minds when we think of God. So let's talk about Zeus for a moment. Zeus was not a good guy. Zeus rose to power by killing his father, Kronos, and then he manipulated his brothers into following him. This is the guy that apparently runs the show, the universe, and particularly the weather and all that kind of stuff. Angry and violent and lost his patience very, very often. Sits on a big white throne, big white beard. Don't want to mess with him. Talk about another ancient god of mankind. This comes from another culture that has affected us arguably even more than the Greeks. The Semitic people, which includes Arabs, Israelites, all of that. This is the god, the Semitic god, Molech, right there. Molech, like many other gods at the time, and unfortunately some today, was willing to bless your family with rain and with good crops, providing you took a child and murdered that child and then offered their blood as a payment for blessing. That's disgusting and extreme. But I want us to see and realize that that kind of divinity and imagery soaked into our consciousness and our perspectives of the divine. And it even carried itself into our theology. Judeo-Christian history is not innocent of this. It even affects the way that we saw the cross and the way that we still see God sitting on his throne. It affects the way that we read the Bible. See, when Adam was consumed by his own guilt and shame, and as deception became more and more embedded in his mind, he and his children forgot more and more the beauty and the glory of the Father through our guilt. And we talked about this, right? How guilt twists our minds concerning another party. It creates distance in our hearts from another individual or individuals. God became in our hearts this distant enemy in the skies who had to be appeased by sacrifice or by good behavior. And that is how you can find his favor and forgiveness. But then one day, on one Christmas morning, everything changed. And that day was probably not December 25th, by the way. It was most likely March. Doesn't really matter when it was. The point is, a baby was born who would grow up to utterly revolutionize and change the whole trajectory of the human race. And his name was Jesus. And Jesus was God incarnate. He was the one who would give us the clearest and most perfect picture of God. In the words of the epistle, he would be the exact representation and the perfect imprint of his Father's essence. The man Jesus shattered everyone's perspective of the Father, especially, and this is the crazy part, especially those who prided themselves in knowing God the best and in knowing their Bibles the best. That's a crazy thought. Jesus was quite different from the Zeuses and the Molechs of the world. And he even brought a very different perspective of God from the Old Testament. Now, listen carefully to what I'm about to say. I am not saying that the God of the Old Testament was different from the God of the New Testament in Christ. What I am saying is that the true face of God was hidden in mankind during the season of the Old Testament. And when you see them relating to God in that time period, you do not see a full expression of who God is. He spoke very often through cloud and smoke and fire. And there's a symbolic imagery there. There's a powerful imagery that God was not revealing at that point, or you could better say with what we've been talking about, we were not seeing, we were turning from the true face of God. Now, his grace shines like silver linings throughout the whole Old Testament. There are beautiful, beautiful times that you can see the grace of God in the Old Testament. It is the same God, but the lights really came on in the New Testament, in the person of Jesus. It wasn't a shadow anymore. Now you get to the perfect image of who God is. So, put Zeus aside, put Molech aside, put even the shallow perspectives that people have from the Old Testament aside for a moment, and let's talk about him. Let's talk about Christ. Because when you see Jesus, you see the Father. Jesus had sinners crowding around him all the time. People liked to be around Jesus. When you read the stories, there's a lot you can infer from the gospel accounts. It's very clear. Now, let me tell you something. Sinners like the type that get mentioned in the New Testament, they are not the kind of people who are comfortable around cold, stoic, holier-than-thou religious people. They stay away from those kind of people. That didn't happen with Jesus at all. As stern and boring that Jesus appears in some of the Hollywood movies that have been made about him, Jesus was actually very likable and very fun. People loved being around him. One of the biggest proof texts of this are the passages where little children are coming up to him and crowding around him, to the point that the disciples have to say, Jesus, send the kids away. They're distracting you from your serious work. And you remember what Jesus said to them. Now, little kids, let me tell you something, have a good internal sensor of who's approachable and who's not. They can sense uptight and angry people. They can. You don't see kids hanging and crowding around cold, stoic, religious people. You just don't. Jesus exhibited this warmth. There was an attraction there that people were drawn to. There was light in him. There was this fragrance and this beauty. He was filled with compassion. He was relational. He was intimate. And he was filled with joy. And yet, in our sorrows, the scriptures give accounts of him weeping with us, weeping with the one who lost their brother. He showed empathy. He showed emotion and understanding. And here's something really amazing about all of this, about Jesus. Jesus never never refused to heal someone who came to him with a sickness or an ailment. Ever. Not once did he refuse to give restoration and to show compassion and forgiveness and mercy to those who came to him for it. Now think about all of this very carefully, all right? Jesus said, I've come not to do my will, but the will of the Father. You could say that Jesus Christ is perfect theology. Jesus Christ reveals the Father perfectly. So it's interesting then that when people came up to Jesus, he never said to them, well, sorry, it's not God's will for you to be healed today. God gave you this because, he's trying to teach you a lesson or something. Sorry, I'm not going to heal your child today. Not going to do that. Never turn people away. Never heaped an ounce of condemnation on people, unless they were the religious ones heaping all the condemnation on others. Then Jesus had a lot of tough things to say for them. He never refused compassion. Think about that. What that shows us, well, it's many things. One of the main things it shows us is that things like sickness and death and disease, all these things that people have attributed to God over the millennia, ever since the distortion in our minds in the garden that they attribute to the judgment of an angry God, all of those things don't actually come from God, not him. In fact, many times when Jesus looks at those who are crippled over in pain, all kinds of things, he talks about loosing them from what Satan has done to them. God is the author of life. Satan is called the author of death in the scriptures. We don't have time to fully unpack this. There's a lot of resources and material out there that we're going to equip you with and give you to study this further through this series. But the phrase, the wrath of God in Scripture, all it's talking about is the passionate love and fiery commitment of God to see us set free. We bring the consequences of sin on ourselves, on other people, and on this world, out of our own deception, out of our own independence. God is not the author of those things by any means. And actually, God's judgments are unto healing and restoration. True biblical judgment involves making things right. That's why the Jews had no problem with this. So you read the Psalms, they say, God, judge us. You read that in many Psalms. Why would they say, God, judge us? Because they understood that God's judgment meant he was going to set them free and make it right. What doctor would get angry with a patient who comes to him with cancer? What father would get angry with their child for having cancer? The only thing that the doctor releases his wrath upon with his scalpel is the cancer, not the patient. Here's what this all boils down to, okay? More than anything else, Jesus revealed Abba, Father. In fact, the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father, who art in heaven. Totally changed it from our Zeus, who reigns in Mount Olympus. He revealed the God of Mount Zion, a God of incredible mercy and compassion, who said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So Jesus showed us essentially, and this is why the Incarnation is so vital for you to understand. This was God, okay? This was him. Jesus reveals the Father to us. He reveals that he's our dad that wants to rescue us from the disease, not dole out punishment and murder. He's not a punitive judge. He's a restorative judge. Plain and simple. In fact, God is love. And according to 1 Corinthians 13, I don't know if you've been to any weddings recently. I've got about 3 next month. 1 Corinthians 13 weddings all over the planet. declares what love is, and God is the essence of what it declares. So you could easily say, God is patient. God is kind. God is not rude. God keeps no record of wrongs. God always believes, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Oh, man. You have permission to be happy this morning? I absolve you from stoic, uptight religion. Okay, so Jesus is God in the flesh, introduced us to the Father again. And that's one of the first steps that the Trinity took when they stepped inside time and space to redeem us from the virus of sin, to set us free. Okay, Jesus did something else in the Incarnation, really, really important. Not only did he reveal the Father, not only did he introduce us to the Father, Jesus introduced us to us. Jesus reveals who we are. So this is the second part of why the Incarnation is eternally essential. You see, in forgetting the face of our Father, we had also forgotten ourselves, because we're made in the image and the likeness of God. Now think about it. Think about all the violence done out in the world in the name of angry and false gods. That happens to this day. We become what we worship. We become what we focus on. We reflect things. We're reflective beings. And that's a systematic problem throughout the world. So we've talked about how books and movies so often declare the story of the gospel in a hidden way. I'm going to close with this. The Lion King. The Lion King is such a beautiful story of the gospel. There's a scene in the movie that powerfully depicts what Jesus Christ revealed to the world. So in the movie, you have the main character, Simba. Simba is a young lion whose father was the king of the land. But his father was killed, and Simba takes on guilt and shame in the movie because he feels responsible for his father's death. And he runs from his inheritance as the next rightful king. Mufasa, Simba's father, is a picture of God in the movie. And Simba is a picture of us hiding, guilt-filled, children of God, running away from who we are, who God's made us to be. So, in the movie, Simba runs into the jungle, into the self-life. He lives life on his own with no one telling him what to do, no responsibility, no anything. But still, you find throughout the movie that something is missing deeply in his heart. But after a long period of time in the wilderness, in the jungle, Simba gets confronted by an old friend. We're going to watch that scene together. And it's the confrontation of all confrontations. And it's the confrontation that God engaged the world in and met us in Jesus Christ. He revealed himself as us in Jesus. And we were like Simba, running from our true inheritance, hiding from our true identity, holding on to a guilt that he was never holding against us. He had already forgiven it from before the foundation of the world, the scriptures say. And the gospel is like that moment when Simba looks into the waters of reflection and he saw his true face. If you keep watching that movie, you see how Simba finally wakes up and he becomes the king, the son that he was called to be. And the truth of that sets him free. Jesus Christ became our mirror. That's why it talks about looking into him and being transformed by the same as into the same image. So let's talk about Jesus one more time. Compassion, love, authority, healed the sick, raised the dead, exuded authority over adverse weather. He walked in the favor, in the blessing of heaven. He walked in intense humility and deep, deep confidence as a son of God. Welcome to your true self. Yeah. That's who you really are. It gets expressed through your unique personality, but that is the essence of who you are as a son and a daughter of the King, filled with this hidden strength and authority and humility and love and strength. This is why Jesus became flesh, to show us that we are glorious containers of our Father in heaven. And it can all be summed up in that statement that Jesus made to his disciples on the night he was going to be arrested and give his life for us, which we're going to start to dive into in the weeks ahead, where he looked at them and said, I am the way. I am the way back into Eden. I am the way back to Pride Rock. I am the way back to your original identity and to the Father, because I am the truth about the Father and the truth about you, and I am the life that you were designed to carry. So come through me back into the Father's arms, because he's always had them open, and he's calling you to himself.